This video is brought to you by contributions to patreon.com/Henry Kathman from viewers like you. Thank you. In my younger and more vulnerable years, a film was released to theaters that I have been turning over in my mind ever since. From the director of Romeo plus Juliet and Moulin Rouge, Baz Luhrmann presents The Great Gatsby. The advertisements and marketing did not say any more, but I understood that such a pitch meant much more than that. For anyone familiar with the Australian director's work in the early 2000s, Baz Luhrmann's Gatsby felt as obvious a pairing of director and project as Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, Terry Gilliam's Don Quixote, and Zack Snyder's Batman. So obvious was this pairing that, like those other examples, the 2013 adaptation of The Great Gatsby has become inextricably tied to the ways that people perceive and discuss F Scot Fitzgerald's original novel. And as this film approaches its 10-year anniversary, after a decade of cultural ubiquity, its presence begs one question.
Hey Baz! Hey Baz! You wanna step outside, mother? Yeah, that's right. I'm talking to you, you literary poacher. Name a time and place. I swear to God, when I'm done with you, you're gonna be... Okay, as easy as it might be to play into the whole hyperbolic internet critic shtick, I don't want to make it appear like this movie is an absolute affront to F. Scot Fitzgerald's original novel. Nor do I want to imply that The Great Gatsby is a story that is so pure a work that it could never be properly adapted. If I were to succinctly collect my thoughts on this film, I'd say... it's fine. It's fine, you guys. It's a competently produced film with some decent performances that retells the story in a straightforward enough manner that someone unfamiliar with the book could understand the overall story and some of its basic themes. But in rewatching this film as many times as I have, it has revealed some of the larger limitations that are at play when it comes to adapting this story to a wider audience, as well as the limitations that can be found within Baz Luhrmann's particular style as a self-described film auteur. For all the criticisms that I'm going to level at this film and its director, and believe me, I have a lot, it cannot be denied that Luhrmann has a great degree of passion for the original novel. Arguably, Luhrmann's most defining trait as a filmmaker is that he holds a great degree of passion for all the materials that he chooses to adapt. Whether it's the world of ballroom dancing, the works of William Shakespeare, classic Hollywood musicals, or most recently, the life of Elvis Presley. And while this passion has resulted in a genuinely unique artistic identity, a lot of Luhrmann's films have been accused of presenting very sanitized versions of these topics in ways that showcase its subjects without nuance or introspection. And I might argue that 2013's Gatsby might be Luhrmann's most egregious example of this. I normally don't like to make such direct statements about an individual artist's mark on a collaborative work like a movie, but when you read through the production history of this film, it's quite apparent that Luhrmann is taking a very authorial perspective on this adaptation, as he would wax poetically about reading Gatsby on a train ride, moving him and his entire family from Australia to Lower Manhattan while he developed the film, and how he would make comparisons between himself, F. Scot Fitzgerald, and Gatsby himself. Going so far as to say that his modernist interpretation of Gatsby is something that Fitzgerald would have done himself.
All of my choices, right, wrong, or indifferent. All the eyeball rolling and easy swipes. Which I'm used to, by the way. Well, he also suffered from that. Fitzgerald was, in quotation marks, a clown. Just like I am.
No, too easy. Say what you will about auteur theory, but if someone like Luhrmann is going to be talking about the original author this way, I think he needs to be discussed on his own terms. Because if there is one thing that demonstrates Luhrmann's desire to place his own identity in this retelling, it can be seen in some of the ways that this film deviates from the original novel. Starting with... Normally, this is the part of the video essay where I would have to give a basic summary of the story for anyone who isn't familiar with The Great Gatsby. But before I get to that, you should honestly take it upon yourself to pick it up. It's never been an easier time to read The Great Gatsby, considering it's been in the public domain since 2021, is available in pretty much every book format one could imagine, including AO3, and it takes about half the time it takes to read Ready Player One, so there really isn't much of an excuse. But, to put simply,
The Great Gatsby follows a young Bond salesman named Nick Carraway over the course of his brief time living in Long Island during the summer of 1922. During that time, he goes to a number of parties of varying quality, gets hit on by his second cousin a concerning number of times, plays third wheel to more than one extramarital affair, witnesses a couple of deaths, and is forced to contend with some of the most detestable people in all of American fiction before deciding that he's tired of all of their bullshit and moved back to the Midwest.
this obviously glosses over a lot of specific plot events that we will get to, but I cannot emphasize enough that almost every major character in this story is some varying degree of being the absolute worst. There's always been some discourse about how likable or how moral fictional characters have to be, but Gatsby is a keen example of the dissonance readers sometimes feel when presented with a cast of characters that they are explicitly not supposed to like. On some levels, this dissonance stems from the ways that we are generally conditioned to empathize with fictional characters, especially if they are the protagonist. So when we see some characters acting immorally, some audiences interpret it as an endorsement of such behaviors. As a result, when examining Gatsby's place in modern pop culture, it is quite common to see those particularly unlikable traits being de-emphasized in various adaptations. One needn't look further than the cast of this film to see this in action.
The first character that Nick hangs out with is his old college friend Tom Buchanan, who isn't just an abusive blowhard coasting off of his college football career, but is considered so racist by the standards of 1920s America that every line makes him sound like Alex Jones, minus the hilarious levels of debt.
The idea is that we're Nordics. I am, you are, and we produced all the things that make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see?
Tom, you suck so much!
As if it wasn't obvious enough that Tom is a repugnant piece of shit, Nick also finds out that Tom is cheating on his wife, Daisy, in the middle of a dinner party when Tom's mistress calls from the other room twice. While we can definitely sympathize with Daisy for a number of reasons, there are plenty of things that also make her almost as unlikable as her husband. Case in point, that aforementioned second cousin that continually flirts with Nick throughout the book.
If you want to kiss me at any time during the evening, Nick, just let me know and I'll be glad to arrange it for you.
Daisy, no! I can similarly apply this to every other character in the story. Jordan Baker, Daisy's best friend and Nick's maybe lover, is a dishonest gossip who thinks that others need to go out of their way to accommodate her irresponsible behavior. When we meet Tom's mistress, Myrtle Wilson, she seems like we could sympathize with her when we see her living in the impoverished industrial hellscape called the Valley of Ashes. However, as soon as she's alone with Tom, she almost immediately starts to treat everyone else like they are below her. And no one likes a class traitor, Myrtle. Not even Myrtle's husband, George, is immune to this, despite being the saddest potato in this whole book. It's implied that Myrtle is pursuing this affair with Tom in response to George being physically and emotionally abusive. Once George catches wind that Myrtle is having an affair, we see him beating her, keeping her prisoner in their home, and making plans to forcefully move her out of New York and isolate her from everyone she's close to. And this is not even getting to Gatsby, who is such an obsessed weirdo that I'm gonna need an entire section for him.
To give some credit to the 2013 film, Luhrmann and the other filmmakers don't try to completely remove any of these traits. All of these traits, including Tom's bigotry, Jordan's gossip, and even Daisy's weird flirtations with Nick, are preserved in the film on some level.
Why did I have to come alone? Are you in love with me?
Daisy, stop!
But even with those inclusions, a lot of the performances in this film see many of the characters' rougher edges sanded off to something that feels much more approachable and relatable. And nowhere does this feel more apparent than in Tobey Maguire's portrayal of Nick Carraway.
Nick is a classic example of an unreliable narrator, as there are multiple points in the story where we can see Nick obfuscating negative details in his retelling of events when he isn't straight up contradicting himself. The first thing Nick says in the story is that he's inclined to reserve all judgments, and later says that he is the most honest person he knows, though the film glosses over a key detail that shows that this is a total lie. As in the book, we learn just how dishonest Nick is once other characters ask him about the news of Nick's engagement to a girl back in Chicago.
Of course I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage.
That's right! Put Nick up on the board of people that cheat on their significant others in this story, because as soon as Nick starts to hook up with Jordan Baker, his first priority becomes figuring out ways that he can break off this relationship in a way that won't damage his reputation.
But I am slow thinking and full of interior rules that act as brakes on my desires, and I knew that first I had to get myself definitely out of that tangle back home. I had been writing letters once a week and signing them, "Love Nick," and all I could think about was how when a certain girl played tennis, a faint mustache of perspiration appeared on her upper lip. Nevertheless, there was a vague understanding that had to be tactfully broken off before I was free.
Nick, you worthless piece of shit!
To be clear, this is not a knock on any of the performances in this film. If anything, two people that deserve massive commendations are casting directors Nikki Barrett and Rona Kress, as the impeccable casting of this film is part of the reason why it is so well regarded today. And to further praise this film, a lot of these issues in characterization can be seen as a product of the original novel.
One of the most common criticisms I see leveled at The Great Gatsby is how Fitzgerald makes his prose thicker than a Pixar mom, because like most obnoxious pseudo-intellectuals, Nick uses fancy words to smokescreen his complacency in the terrible events that occur in the story.
Putting aside unreliable narration, something else that helps to make Nick and the other characters less conspicuously awful is the fact that they have to share page space with Tom Buchanan, who, I cannot emphasize enough, sucks so much of a turd that it makes every other character in this book look like a saint in comparison.
Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by that man Godard? Well, it's a fine book, and everyone ought to read it. The idea is that we don't look out. The white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Well, these books are all scientific. These fellows have worked out a whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out for all these other races will control things.
Tom, you suck so much!
Fun fact, this line is a parody of a real-life book titled The Rising Tide of Color, The Threat Against World White Supremacy, a best-selling novel from 1920 that received glowing reviews from the New York Times, which I'm sure was the first and last time that the New York Times visibly platformed reactionary weirdos. While I think that making Tom a racist, reactionary conservative as shorthand for why he sucks is an interesting and somewhat ahead of its time move on Fitzgerald's part, considering some of the anti-Semitic garbage that shows up in later parts of the novel, I also find it interesting that Nick, who claims to reserve all judgments on other people, doesn't ever try to push back against Tom whenever he tries to justify his harsh judgment on marginalized people using conspiratorial nonsense. That's because Nick, above all else, is still a member of the old money elite that Tom, Jordan, and Daisy reside in.
Despite not being as wealthy as his cousin, we routinely see the ways that Nick still embroiled himself into the world of the old money of East Egg, and any of the ideologies that come with such a position. Probably the best example of this is the way that Nick reacts when he enters New York and is astonished to see a car full of, gasp, black people driven by, gasp again, a white chauffeur.
As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled toward us in haughty rivalry.
Yeah, interesting. Couple of questions, though. Firstly, hey Nick, what the hell? Mind your own goddamn business! Fuck weirdo. God. But the second question that this raises is what other terrible qualities could Nick be hiding underneath his narration and Maguire's charismatic performance?
I bought cakes.
One of the most notable changes made in this novel is the inclusion of a framing device which sees a now traumatized Nick seeking recovery in a sanitarium, with the story of the Great Gatsby being brought about as a means of processing his grief and distress. On one hand, this does add the benefit of being able to incorporate Fitzgerald's original writing more naturally into the plot, and it could serve as a signal to the audience to not completely trust Nick's retelling of things. But for many, the opposite is achieved, and Nick is way more sympathetic a perspective, as nowadays we tend to look upon those seeking mental health treatment with a larger degree of empathy than we did in the 1920s.
Look, I never said we were great at it.
But in addition to this, many other things are done to help make Nick more sympathetic. We only get one passing line referencing Nick's rumor engagement.
Nicky, I heard a rumor that you were getting married to a girl out west.
It's a libel. I'm too poor.
And similarly, a lot of the moments that characterize Nick as a condescending will have Maguire portraying Nick with more of a bewildered curiosity that acts as the defining trait of the performance. Though perhaps the strangest addition made with Nick is this added emphasis on his romance with Jordan Baker. In the original book, Nick and Jordan seem to hook up, but we don't know to what degree the two actually care for one another, as Jordan at one point tells Nick how she specifically likes him because he doesn't act as carelessly as she does on a regular basis. Though instead of going for the messy drama of this relationship as seen in the book, the movie decides to give Nick a rival for Jordan's affections in the form of Teddy Barton, who is presumably based on the real-life player for the Tranmere Rover Football Club. During the first party that Nick attends at Gatsby's mansion, we see the ways that Nick is able to charm Jordan, only for Teddy to come rushing in and try to steal Jordan away from him in one of the most unsubtle performances of this film.
Sam, have this dance. Oh, you penniless panty waist.
Like, y'all, I get that he's supposed to be this one-off character that doesn't factor into the larger story after this scene, but this Saxon motherfucker has the audacity to tell Nick off by hitting him with that often misquoted adage, "Rich girls don't marry poor boys." And yeah, I guess it's cute that they wanted to throw in a reference to the 1974 film, but of all the people to throw this line to, why go with Yale graduate Nick Carraway of the Carraway Hardware Store dynasty? I know that these changes are meant to make Nick a more relatable character so he can act as a better surrogate for the audience, but in these attempts to make Nick more of an everyman, it actively discourages audiences from viewing the events of this story with much needed skepticism, resulting in a version of Gatsby that pulls its punches with its critiques of the wealthy. Case in point.
By the tail end of Chapter 3, Nick attends one of Gatsby's famous parties for the first time. These parties take up a lot of space in the cultural memory of the story, but for me, the most important moment that happens in this chapter occurs when Nick is later leaving the party and proceeds to witness probably the most famous drunk driving scene in all of modern literature. Not even 2 minutes after leaving Gatsby's party, the drivers of this brand new luxury car managed to crash into a wall on Gatsby's estate, tearing off one of the front wheels, crashing into a ditch, and the drivers are so wasted, they don't even realize that the car had crashed, much to the bemusement of the other partygoers.
What's the matter?
He inquired calmly.
Did we run out of gas?
Look! Half a dozen fingers pointed at an amputated wheel. He stared at it for a moment, and then looked upward as if he suspected that it had dropped from the sky. It came off, someone explained. He nodded.
At first I didn't notice we'd stopped.
A pause. Then, taking a long breath and straightening his shoulders, he remarked in a determined voice,
Wonder if tell me where there's a gasoline station.
At least a dozen men, some of them little better off than he was, explained to him that wheel and car were no longer joined by any physical bonds.
Back out,
he suggested after a moment.
Put her in reverse.
But the wheel's off. He hesitated.
No harm in trying, he said.
There are a lot of reasons that the scene stands out to me. For one, the image of these two dudes trying to drunkenly drive home while missing a front wheel will never not be hilarious to me. But something that I also like about this scene is that the ways that it embodies a lot of this story's societal critiques in such a simple manner.
To start off, by the time The Great Gatsby was published in 1925, Prohibition had been the law in the United States for half a decade, which made the sale and consumption of alcohol illegal under the 18th Amendment of the Constitution. And this scene lays bare a lot of the hypocrisies at play within its enforcement.
While many people like to fixate on the ways that Prohibition led to the rise of organized crime, the longest consequence of this time period is the ways that it allowed for some of the largest expansions of state power in American history, as the enforcement of Prohibition saw working class people more severely punished and surveyed by groups like the newly formed Bureau of Investigations, a group that would later become the FBI, increasingly funded city police, and let's see, who else? Oh, yeah, that's right, the goddamn KKK!
One of the many ways that such groups manufactured consent from the public is through the increased study and education of the legitimate dangers of alcoholism, which helped to bring more awareness to these issues, but also allowed such groups to mask their expanded reaches of power as a righteous moral crusade. Meanwhile, the drivers in the scene are so drunk that they can't tell that they have crashed their car, a casebook example of all of the evils Prohibition claimed to be fighting, and yet, there isn't any indication that they or any of the other party guests face any consequences or punishments as a result of their wealth. And speaking of wealth, consider what it says about these two drivers that they don't seem to display an ounce of concern over the car. While we don't have any specific makes or models of any of the cars driven in this book, most high-end coupes in 1922s like the Marmon 34 or the Daytona Page could cost someone anywhere from $50,000 to $85,000 in today's money. And for most people, the process of being in a car accident can be an exceptionally frustrating and costly experience that can become prohibitively expensive, especially if you're already someone that doesn't have a lot of money to throw around. Decades before psychologists published studies demonstrating the ways that wealthier people are more likely to break driving laws, Fitzgerald demonstrates the ways that wealth causes people to become desensitized to the consequences of their actions, a fact that becomes even more apparent when we witness a much more devastating car accident later in the story. But for all of those criticisms, the last thing that makes this scene stick out to me is the ways that it also embodies the themes of optimism and hope that are carried throughout the novel. Gatsby, who is described as possessing an extraordinary gift for hope, is seen as an aspirational figure for so many because of the ways that he continues to pursue his dreams despite the clear and obvious obstacles that stand in his way. For these two drivers, the notion that they could ever be able to drive this car to a gas station while missing a front wheel could be seen as just as an impossible feat as poor farm boy James Gatz being able to marry someone like Daisy Buchanan. But in the face of that impossibility, the two attempt to make that drive anyway. While this could be seen as a positive message, it's important to remember that the drunk drivers were going to be fine whether they made it to the gas station or not. Unlike Gatsby, who wasn't born into the massive levels of wealth and privilege, there really is no harm in trying for the wealthiest people in our society, partially because that harm is often redirected to people like Myrtle, George, and Gatsby. Even though this scene barely lasts 2 pages in a book with an already generous small word count, it continues to stick out amongst so many other moments in Gatsby for the ways that it manages to embody the different issues and themes that the book is contending with, all the while foreshadowing future events in such a light and approachable manner.
So, with all of that subtext and analysis in mind, how does Luhrmann put this scene to film?
I'll call you up.
Well, alright then.
To be clear, I don't think this movie is inherently lesser just because they left out this scene, considering that pretty much every other major adaptation of Gatsby also cuts it out. But my main reason for highlighting it here is that it pretty much encapsulates a lot of my thoughts on the ways that Luhrmann portrays the parties of this story, similar to the different characters of the novel. The depiction of the parties in this story maintains a lot of the exterior elements of the original story, but softens some of the ideas that they are trying to present. But this is one of those moments where I want to go back to the positives of this movie, because I think a lot of this can be attributed to the artistry and skill on display from Luhrmann and the other filmmakers, like cinematographer Simon Dugan, editors Jason Ballantine, Jonathan Redman, and Matt Villa, as well as the production designers Karen Murphy and Catherine Martin, who also acted as the film's costume designer.
This sounds like a backhanded compliment, like, oh man, this isn't as good as the book because people were too good at their jobs, but what I mean to say is that in applying the style of Luhrmann's other films to a story like Gatsby, it effectively showcases the fun that could be had in the excess of the 1920s, but it does so without demonstrating the severe human costs that came from it. Wait, no, that's basically what I just said. Oh,
If you're familiar with Luhrmann's other films like Simply Ballroom, Romeo plus Juliet, and Moulin Rouge, you will recognize the same presentation style in Gatsby. In an interview with Vulture conducted in 2022, Luhrmann described his chaotic filmmaking style as a means of providing the audience enough information and stimulation to help build to a moment he calls signing the contract, where the movie offers an encapsulation of its style and the audience is given a choice of whether they accept the movie or not.
The idea of that, the pacing and the editing and all of that, is to make you kind of lean forward and go, I've got to work here as an audience member. I can't just sit back and eat my popcorn. I need to absorb this information. After signing the contract, you're either into the style of film or you're not. You're coming with us or you're not. And some people do leave the theater and go, I don't know what this is. I'm out.
In Gatsby, the moment where Luhrmann signs the contract is arguably the moment when Nick finally meets Gatsby. Up to that moment in the scene, the film manages to capture the fervent chaos that Fitzgerald describes in the novel.
The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun. And now, the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier by the minute. spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word.
You could easily overlay this narration to scenes from this film, and you'd see the ways that it cleanly lines up with the overall structure of the story. Just as Nick is filled with this uncertainty and confusion of being the only guest to receive a formal invitation to one of Gatsby's parties, the rapid editing, the quick-paced dialogue, and the intense soundtrack create a similar feeling of overstimulation within the audience. All this continues to build up as Nick strikes up a conversation with one of the attendants of the party, mentioning the notable absence of its host Gatsby, only for Luhrmann to present the contract for the audience to sign, when the other man responds to Nick,
"Afraid I haven't been a very good host, old sport. You see, I'm Gatsby."
And say what you will about the rest of this film, even after a decade, this moment is what gets me to sign that contract every time, as it perfectly encapsulates the ways that Jay Gatsby tries to present himself as this charismatic, bombastic showman who is able to present his wealth and success in ways that it is impossible to ignore. Which is probably why you will see this exact shot continually reused in memes and reaction gifs today.
All of this acts as an exceptionally faithful image of Gatsby's party, but it is only an image. Despite how fun and carefree these parties in Gatsby are made to seem, we later learn that both hide a more vacuous and cynical interior. For Gatsby, he meticulously constructs a persona of what he thinks a perfect member of the upper class is meant to be: charming, well-spoken, educated, heroic, and generous. Here is a man who had supposedly achieved the American dream, pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and gained all the things that we are told make us happy. And yet, we come to learn just how miserable Gatsby ends up being, as he continually sacrificed his own well-being and identity in the pursuit of maintaining this persona of the Great Gatsby. Even though these parties are shown to be these exciting events filled with the biggest people and personalities of the era, no one in attendance actually seems to be interested in better understanding who Gatsby is as a person. Probably because they can tell that there isn't much going on under the hood of that yellow car. As we're going to discuss later, the ultimate tragedy for Jay Gatsby is how he did everything he possibly could to gain the things that we are conditioned to pursue in American society, only for the elite of that society to still reject him because of who he is. Part of the reason I bemoan the exclusion of the drunk driving scene in this adaptation is that it serves as a vital reminder that by the end of these kinds of parties, someone is going to be left to clean up that mess, and all of the parties have to stop at some point. And for Gatsby, the mess originates from the real reason Jay transformed himself into the Great Gatsby: the pursuit of the golden girl, Daisy Buchanan.
If that last section wasn't any indication, the character that has been most heavily romanticized in this story is Jay Gatsby. Part of that is a consequence of Nick's narrative descriptions of him being so positive that it borders on romantic pining, which makes sense considering that for as unreliable Nick is as a narrator, he was the only one who really came to learn and understand Gatsby's life, and was likewise the only one who could see the tragedy in Gatsby's dream of being accepted into the highest ranks of American society. What doesn't make sense, however, is the ways that the movie chooses to completely direct all of that tragedy into the romance between Daisy and Gatsby.
When people discuss The Great Gatsby nowadays, it is not uncommon for people to consider it one of the greatest tragic love stories alongside the likes of Romeo and Juliet and Orpheus and Eurydice. And I can't say I blame anyone for drawing those comparisons, especially when you consider Baz Luhrmann's previous collaborations with Leonardo DiCaprio. After all, One could easily read all three works as stories about two lovers being kept apart by larger forces outside of their control. For Romeo and Juliet, those forces take the form of the adults trying to control their lives. And with Orpheus and Eurydice, those forces are made much more literal as Orpheus contends with the literal god of death in his pursuit of Eurydice. But, unlike those other examples, I would argue that Gatsby can't be considered tragic in the same way because Gatsby had a much larger level of control over how his story ends. And I don't say this like a CinemaSins, why didn't they just break up kind of thing, but in the sense that the forces that prevent Gatsby from being with Daisy is his own failure to acknowledge the ways that she kind of sucks. Just like every other character mentioned up to this point, Daisy is shown to be a pretty detestable person, and not just for being low-key incestuous towards Nick. Despite dealing with all of the unpleasantness that could come with being married to someone like Tom, throughout the story, Daisy continually demonstrates the ways that her absurd levels of privilege have left her either unable or unwilling to make choices for herself, oftentimes letting other people take the responsibility and consequences for her own choices and mistakes. Though, in fairness to Daisy, she was never given any opportunity to think for herself due to the social restrictions being placed on women during this era, which is something that not even Gatsby gives her a chance to do.
Because here's the thing you gotta understand about Gatsby. When you take away his fancy parties, his pink suits, his yellow cars, and the old sports of it all, Gatsby is a dork loser. I say this with the utmost affection, but you gotta understand, if we're being honest, if Gatsby was around today, he would either be one of those dudes that would really get into the manosphere, or would have pretended to read Marx so he could hook up with goth chicks.
Either way, like other dork losers, Gatsby is convinced that he needs to be in a relationship in order to be happy. And because of this, we see Gatsby putting all of his energy into this blind pursuit of Daisy. From purchasing a whole mansion so he can live physically close to her, throwing all of these parties in the hopes that she might happen to show up, and meticulously engineering the perfect scenario where he can reintroduce himself to Daisy. Anyone who has ever been in a healthy long-term relationship can tell you that these kinds of dudes are dork losers because they rarely ever consider the humanity of the people they are romantically interested in. For as much as Gatsby claims to love Daisy, it's pretty clear that he doesn't really view her as her own person with wants and needs, and more of the last piece of a puzzle he needs to complete the image of success that he has been told will bring fulfillment to his life. Case in point, once Gatsby and Daisy are reunited, she's actually pretty down to start hooking up almost immediately. Which, I can't really blame her, considering that Tom is a cheating douchebag, and Gatsby is the one dude that she isn't related to that is actually giving her a degree of affection and attention. But for Gatsby, it isn't enough to just be in a relationship with Daisy. He wants to be able to control his and her life to such a degree that he basically wants to turn back time.
He wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, "I never loved you." After she had obliterated 4 years with that sentence, they could decide upon the more practical measures to be taken. One of them was that, after she was free, they were to go back to Louisville and be married from her house, just as it was 5 years ago.
Like, y'all, if someone you met at a party 5 years ago came out of nowhere asking you to completely upend your life so that you could pretend that the last 5 years didn't happen, would you really see this as romantic? Because if we're going by the framing presented in the 2013 film, Baz Luhrmann would want you to think so.
Here was a film about a person who had come from nothing, from a dirt poor farm background, and who had created himself, and he could have made himself illegally wealthy and be this fantastical for corrupt reasons. But actually, it turns out he has a cause, and it is for all issues of the heart, and this makes him a hero. So he is the most romantic of anti-heroes, if you like.
Oh, cool! Anti-hero. Is that what we're calling this, Baz? Cool. Cool stuff.
Now, to be fair to Luhrmann and the other filmmakers, This kind of reading is far from unique to the 2013 film, as this has been a guiding principle for pretty much every other adaptation of the story over the past couple of years. I also think it is fair to say that the conventions of fictional relationships don't have to align with the standards of healthy relationships placed in the real world. In the case of this film, the aim does seem to make this as justifiable a romance as possible, while still sticking with the original novel. In one of the most effective changes made by this film, we get an added emphasis on Nick and Gatsby's time serving in World War I. In the book, it's clear that Nick experienced little to no actual trauma out of his experience, that he even describes himself as feeling restless when he returns to the States. And we also receive very little indication that his time in the war had very little effect on Gatsby. This is not the case in the film, as we see brief moments where Gatsby finds himself in the trenches, is lost in a sea of doomed soldiers, and is implied to be left with what was then called shell shock, but we now recognize as PTSD.
I like this edition for a lot of reasons. Not just because it provides a shockingly rare example of a character being a trauma survivor without it being their defining trait, but it also helps to reframe Gatsby's pursuit of Daisy as a coping mechanism for witnessing the trauma of the first modern industrial war, which is a reading that is pretty well supported by the text.
He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something. Some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was.
While I do think this is an extremely interesting direction to take the story, the fact that it appears so infrequently in the movie makes it ultimately feel like an attempt to make Gatsby more sympathetic and relatable to audiences, rather than a sincere attempt to discuss a pressing issue that is just as relevant today as it was in 1922.
And that's kind of the feeling I get with this portrayal of Gatsby in this film. Instead of portraying an extremely flawed man that believed in this retrieval of a perceived perfection justified whatever heinous act that he might have done, Luhrmann makes Gatsby like himself, a showman who just wanted to throw the most spectacular parties, all in the hopes of getting those around him to sign that contract and go along with whatever image he wanted to present to you.
But even by the standards set by the original story, keen-eyed readers can pretty quickly tell that Gatsby's elaborate endgame, where he is somehow able to get Daisy to divorce Tom, remarry her with her parents' approval, move back to Louisville, and ingratiate himself into the world of old money, it's just not going to happen, if only because of the oft-overlooked factor that is Pammy. When I said that every single primary character in this book is meant to be unlikable, the one exception you could make is Pamela Buchanan, Daisy and Tom's daughter, though I attribute that to the fact that she is 3 years old more than any successful parenting on the Buchanan's part. Even though she is mentioned by name only one time and makes a single appearance in the entire story, Gatsby's reaction to meeting Pammy is quite revealing.
Gatsby and I, in turn, leaned down and took the small, reluctant hand. Afterward, he kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he had ever really believed in its existence before.
Though her conspicuous absence in the story is a testament to just how irresponsible Tom and Daisy are as people, it also demonstrates that for all of the effort Jay put into manifesting this persona of the Great Gatsby, he is still unwilling to acknowledge the reality that Daisy is not the same person he met in that party in 1917. While I doubt that Pammy is going to deal with a lot of issues as a result of her parents staying in this loveless marriage, I also find it very hard to imagine any scenario that Gatsby would want to pursue that involved keeping Pammy in his life, considering that she would remain a perpetual reminder of the ways that Daisy was undeniably in a committed relationship with someone else before him, a fact that I can't imagine dork loser Gatsby being able to handle in the long term. But similar to other moments that are cut from the film, it's striking that such an unflattering moment for Gatsby is left behind. as if to imply that things might have worked out between Gatsby and Daisy had they not been kept apart by uncontrollable circumstances.
So, when Lana Del Rey sings "Will You Still Love Me When I'm No Longer Young and Beautiful" over these romantic montages over this relationship, the fact that this film can't answer with an obvious no is pretty emblematic of the ways that, for all of its purported reverence for the novel and its willingness to be accurate to the words of F. Scot Fitzgerald, it doesn't grasp perhaps the most important yet often ignored lesson of this story.
So a couple of years ago, I had to help out with a high school prom, and I received this catalog filled with different kinds of party favors and decorations we could order for the school. We never bought anything from it, to my knowledge, but I still keep it around just to showcase this one section of different props that could have been bought if you wanted to theme your prom to the 1920s. Especially,
take a ride back to the roaring 20s for prom, your homecoming dance, senior party, or school drama production with this fabulous yellow Gatsby car photo prop. The 5'8" high, 17'8" wide, 6'10" deep, authentic-looking printed cardboard 3D car features real working headlights and doors, so students can pose inside it for fun selfies. Designed for one-time use, assembly required.
Car is huge and extremely time-consuming.
This behemoth of a car is huge and takes way more than 6 hours, as stated on the directions, to complete.
If you have the time, then go for it. But this is a one-time decoration, and it is way too hard to break down.
Also, once it's together, there is no way to preserve it or break it down to rebuild it later. It is a one-time throwaway. After one kid gets in, the thing starts to fall apart.
If I had any idea how long it would take and how difficult it was to move, I would have never done it.
It took a team of 6 people 12 hours to put this car together.
Yep, because when I want to host an event for a demographic that is most likely to have recently read The Great Gatsby, I would definitely want to shell out $634.99 to pay tribute to perhaps the most famous example of vehicular manslaughter in modern fiction. Okay, that was supposed to be a joke, but if I'm going to be 100% honest with myself, I totally would have shelled out money for that if I could. Patreon.com/Henry Kaufman. The main reason I wanted to bring up this weird, exorbitantly priced piece of cardboard is that, for me, it's a perfect symbol for the ways that the themes and the messages of The Great Gatsby have become largely ignored as it has been subsumed into modern pop culture. A process that we can greatly attribute to the 2013 film. Case in point, consider the kind of stuff that they did for the soundtrack.
in a move that baffled some critics upon its initial release, Luhrmann decided to combine the jazz of the 1920s with modern hip-hop and pop in his collaboration with Jay-Z. Luhrmann has never been one to shy away from using anachronistic music within his films, but I'd argue that this is perhaps the most effective usage of this kind of music. Unlike Moulin Rouge or Elvis, which utilizes its modern-day soundtracks as sort of a musical shorthand for the emotions on display in these films, Gatsby's soundtrack manages to comment on the time period of the story by drawing a clear connection between jazz and hip-hop. After all, both genres follow a similar history of originating in predominantly black spaces, being subject to moral panics that served as thinly veiled white supremacist agendas, only to gain cultural dominance after it became marketable to white audiences, with only a handful of the predominantly black artists who helped it achieve that dominance getting the credit and compensation that they deserved. And as one of those artists who helped hip-hop achieve that dominance, Jay-Z was probably one of the most qualified people you could get with in creating such a fusion for this particular story, especially when you consider the number of people comparing the life and career of Sean J. Carter to James J. Gatsby. Like the origins of J. Gatsby, the myth of Jay-Z follows the story of Sean Corey Carter, born to poor parents, creating a new name for himself, being involved in different illegal activities in his younger years, only to seemingly emerge amongst the upper class out of nowhere and create a massive business empire. Just like J. Gatsby, people like to hold up the story of Jay-Z as an embodiment of the American dream. This idea that anyone who works hard enough and changes themselves can achieve the financial and social success they dream of. But anyone who knows about Carter's different business ventures knows that for as much as he claims to be disrupting the paradigms that dictate the United States, the people and institutions he supports demonstrate his commitment to maintaining those same paradigms that harm a majority of black people throughout the world. And I think this is also a pretty fair comparison to Gatsby, as his pursuit of wealth didn't come with the goal of improving the lives of those around him, but were a flashy spectacle to obfuscate the self-serving motivations that dictate his action.
With all of this, the music, the acting, the changes made to the story, causes the movie to liken itself to Nick Carraway in how it deceptively presents an idealized version of the story to its audiences. Similar to Nick, I don't imagine that the filmmaker sought out to misrepresent Gatsby, but rather, I think the level of affection that Luhrmann and the other filmmakers had for this story caused them to offer the most charitable interpretations of this text, and likewise, softening anything that audiences might have found unrelatable or uncomfortable.
While it might seek to present the text of the book as accurately as possible, to the point where we can often see the literal text being imposed on the screen, this movie is a key example of how someone can be accurate to the literal text of a story and still manage to misrepresent its primary themes. To quote Tessa McLean's paper, Preserving Utopia, Musical Style in Baz Luhrmann's The Great Gatsby,
despite bringing the novel's themes into the present through contemporary music, Luhrmann has utilized musical styles to celebrate rather than investigate the American classic, preserving and perpetuating the romantic utopia of the American dream.
Taking everything that we have discussed into consideration, from the detestable characters, the destructive excesses of the era, to Gatsby's doomed romantic expectations, Gatsby the story can be taken as a lesson of the dangers of romanticizing the past. On a purely textual level, we can see how Gatsby's inability to move on from the past creates what Nick describes as the foul dust that floats in the wakes of his dreams. Not just leaving Gatsby an empty shell that can never feel satisfied with his own accomplishments, but choking the life and happiness out of countless other people with that same foul dust. While the film's soundtrack proclaims "A little party never killed nobody," we know that isn't true when Daisy runs over Myrtle Wilson with Gatsby's car, and George goes on to murder Gatsby as a final act of revenge before shooting himself. But on an even broader scale, Gatsby presents modern audiences a similar danger in romanticizing Fitzgerald's jazz age by demonstrating the kinds of problems that could be found in the United States both then and now. From the pervasive influence of white supremacist ideology, the lack of legal and social consequences directed towards the wealthy, and the ways that we tend to harshly punish anyone that deviates from the most reactionary versions of the status quo, despite calling ourselves the land of the free. All of this foul dust that we contend with in the wake of this fiction that we call the American dream, which has allowed the Tom Buchanans of our world to marginalize and attack the most vulnerable people in our society, under the delusion that it can bring us back to a non-existent time where we can be great again. And the reason why those Tom Buchanans are able to get away with this as much as they have is because there are so many people like Gatsby who have bought into this bullshit. People who make themselves miserable in the pursuit of a version of success and happiness that only the most wealthy elites can hope to achieve. Being told that if they just grind harder, run faster, stretch your arms harder, one fine morning, you too can reach that orgastic future that year by year recedes before us.
And what makes this especially tragic is that even when you do everything that's expected of you, and you manage to grind your way up to the highest echelons of American society, the Tom Buchanans of our world will still find reasons to reject you. Because they never actually had any intention of sharing their wealth and privilege with the rest of us. Because, as the movie Tom puts it,
we're different. I am, they are, she is. We're all different from you. You see, we were born different. It's in our blood.
Steal nothing that you do, or say, or steal, or dream up. You ever take that?
Tom, you suck so much.
While I think there are a litany of valid criticisms for the novel alongside praises for the film, I ultimately agree with Tessa McLean's assessment of the film, celebrating the different aspects of American life presented in The Great Gatsby, without really interrogating the problems that can come out of that celebration. And while you could certainly place blame on Luhrmann's prioritization of gaining the audience's attention and approval instead of challenging them, I think it is a testament to the ways that the dominant culture of white supremacist, imperialist, patriarchal capitalism seeks to maintain that dominance by subsuming any critiques of the culture into itself. In seeking to adapt a story that is heavily critical of different aspects of American life for the purposes of making the most profitable film possible, companies like Warner Brothers transform stories like The Great Gatsby into a reinforcement of the same forces it sought to criticize. Instead of seeing the crushing loneliness found in a person like Gatsby, we are encouraged to revel in the fun that is found in his parties. Instead of recognizing how dehumanizing it must feel for Daisy to become an object of obsession, we are serenaded with Lana Del Rey songs highlighting the romance found in that kind of obsession. Instead of gaining an understanding of the ways that someone like Nick can easily obfuscate the truth, we are presented with a likable everyman that we can unquestioningly relate to. Instead of seeing Gatsby's yellow car as a manifestation of the destructive nature of wealth in the ways that it is a catalyst for all three deaths in the book, it is made a marketable set piece that can be used to produce flimsy imitations to be sold at exorbitant prices.
So, what's the point that could be taken from all of this? Well, as I said at the start of the video, I don't think this movie is an especially bad work on its own. If you enjoyed this movie or prefer it to the book, that's fine. But from my vantage point, I think that the 2013 Gatsby film serves as a reminder that there is no such thing as a faithful adaptation. Even when artists claim to bring about the most literal translation of a work into another medium, there will always be some aspect that is going to find itself being reinterpreted. By definition, the process of adapting a work from one medium into another necessitates change, which doesn't have to be a bad thing. Now that The Great Gatsby is in the public domain, we don't have to accept this film as the definitive version of this story, but perhaps an invitation for us to look at stories like Gatsby and think of the ways that we can apply them to the issues that face our modern world. That's what adaptations are for, right? Allowing folks to share their own perspectives on the world through well-known stories. And yeah, some might say that retelling a single story isn't going to single-handedly change the world, but one could always dream, right? Yeah. But until next time, thank you for watching. Best wishes. Also, this movie totally copped out on showing Nick getting absolutely ravaged by Mr. McKee at the end of Chapter 2. Like, come on, Baz. You expect me to believe that Nick just happened to be standing by that man's bed while McKee was only clad in his underwear? No. No way. I refuse to believe that you wouldn't have seized on that opportunity to have Tobey Maguire getting his Yale ass absolutely ravaged. So, let's have it, Luhrmann, you Aussie coward. I want that twink obliterated! Release the McKee Cut, motherfucker!